So the rules of engagement for the lightning talks will be, we have 5 students, they get 10 minutes each. There will be no Q&A afterwards, after each talk, it's just one right after the other. And I have a timer up here that will time their 10 minutes, and an alarm will sound, whether if they're finished or not. They need to finish their talk, and then we'll move on to the next student. The winner will win $500 tech cash. So there's a big reward on the line here. And after the last talk, we'll display a QR code for the audience to vote on who they think is the best presentation. There's only one winner, so you can only get to pick one talk. Without further ado, our first talk is Julia Briden.
Hello, everyone. My name is Julia Briden, and I'm currently a third-year graduate student in the MIT ARCLab, majoring in aero, astro, and statistics. And I'll be working on improving the computational efficiency of power descent guidance. So first, let's look at some motivating goals. So power descent guidance is currently not computationally efficient enough to run on resource-constrained rad-hard processors for these long horizon problems. And so if we consider what JPL and ESA currently do, is they look at polynomial splines for computing power descent trajectories. And while this is not fuel optimal, we do know that SpaceX can perform fuel optimal short horizon optimal maneuvers, but this can only really be done like one trajectory generation and can't really be done multiple times. So as we look further into Artemis 3 and human Mars exploration, larger diverts are going to be required at faster rates due to very high mass requirements. So for example, requiring about 10-kilometer large diverts or large horizontal movements that need to be computed online and fuel optimally, subject to a set of state and control constraints. And so EDL processes need to be computed on the order of milliseconds. And this is done by formulating an optimal control problem with a set of cost functions, equations of motions, which can include kind of ODE constraints, inequality constraints on our state and control, in addition to boundary constraints. And so while this is often a non-convex formulation, through the process of lossless convexification, convergence to a globally optimal solution is ensured. And we have 15n plus 9 total constraints. And while that seems like not too many, as we increase our discretization, so our capital N, we see that the number of constraints grows quite quickly. And at 500 discretization nodes, we have over 7,500 constraints. And looking inside the interior point method solver, we can see how we can improve this computational efficiency. So the size of the system of equations that's solved during this interior point method is dependent on that number of constraints. But consider if we can actually predict the set of tight constraints and identify potentially a more direct path to our optimal solution. And that's what we propose in this work. So we propose mapping from a set of parameters to something we call a strategy, which is our set of tight constraints and optimal final time. So our parameters include our initial state, a set of parameters related to our state and control constraints. And then we want to learn our f of theta to predict our tight constraints, which is a binary vector of zeros and ones, 0 if the constraint's not tight, or 1 if the constraint's predicted to be tight. We also want to predict our final time because in this 3-DOF scenario, if our final time is free, then it would become non-convex. And so this works very well for a learning-based method if we want to learn a map between a set of parameters and an optimal strategy. And we have a few different learning-based methods to choose from, but in this work, we used the transformer and created transformer-based power descent guidance. And that's mostly because transformers allow us to learn these sequences in parallel and are also quite quick in terms of mean prediction time. So they take about 2 to 3 milliseconds to run at inference time, and that's quite quick even compared to, for example, lookup tables. And so this is what our architecture looks like, with the main component being our transformer encoder. and our predicted set of tight constraints is dependent on n. So now looking into the training and test process, usually engineers will already have a representative sample of the trajectories that they want to train from through a process known as Monte Carlo analysis. This is usually done during the design process. But in our case, we just did a quick uniform sphere sampling to generate a data set of tight constraints and optimal final times. And then we divided that data set into training and test data. So the training data was used to train a PyTorch mapping using that transformer architecture. And then during test, we were able to take that extra data that wasn't used during training and validate that we were able to successfully test the network's ability to predict those constraints. So for this real-time application, now that we're able to compute the constraints that we identified to be tight, we can actually create a reduced problem where we're only enforcing the constraints that we predict to be active, use that reduced problem to then solve the full problem, which we call the feasibility test. And this ensures that we have 100% feasibility. So now looking at an application, which is our 3 degree of freedom Mars power descent guidance scenario, we tested TPDG on 50 discretization nodes, used a little bit over 240,000 samples. And the benchmark time we wanted to compare against is a little over 1.6 seconds. So that's the solve time that was computed by the lossless convexification algorithm without this initial guess. And by applying TPDG, we were able to show that our mean computation time was reduced by over 78%, and specifically achieved around 400 millisecond mean computation times using this method. And furthermore, since this is kind of a warm start method to a direct optimization solver, we have 100% feasibility. So now, since this is a learning-based approach, everyone's very interested in, is this interpretable and is this generalizable? We'll consider, for example, explicit model predictive control. We know that the state space is divided into separate polytopes that kind of define a control policy region. Well, we can actually look at the transformer neural network's embedding space through the use of t-distributed stochastic neighbor embeddings and see that there's kind of clusters that come about that are almost representative of that explicit MPC's control policies for each of these clusters. So this is what our TSNE projection looks like on test data for our tight constraints neural network. And the colors denote the number of tight constraints that are active at our optimal solution. So the purple region has less tight constraints active, while the kind of brighter region has a lot more of those tight constraints. So generally, we can say that we see one lobe of less tight constraints as well as one lobe of more tight constraints. And what we're really interested in determining is what are the range of parameter inputs that actually lead to these constraint divisions. And so we can use a quick k-means clustering to get an idea of which points belong to each cluster in our TSNE plot. And then we can map back to the set of input distributions that define each of these clusters. So here are input distributions for a set of positions, as well as their initial z velocity and glide slope angle. And so these were denoted to be kind of the most important division between these two clusters. But the general shape that we see is that the cluster with a lot of constraints active has a lot wider standard deviation compared to the cluster that has a lot less of those constraints active, which is our red distribution. And something else interesting to notice is that the trajectory that was sampled around is very close to the mean, especially of the less tight constraint structure. And furthermore, we were able to see that the test time points that had greater than 90% accuracy were inside of that red region, inside of the region that had less tight constraints and is also smaller standard deviation. And so this is able to give us an idea of what kind of input distributions will give us accurate test time predictions from this transformer neural network, and gives us insight into the policies that this network is using as well. And so for that wider distribution, we're able to show that that would be kind of the out of distribution samples. And looking at our conclusions and future work, we're able to show that TPDG is able to reduce the 3 degree of freedom power descent guidance solve time from over 1.5 seconds to under 500 milliseconds. And also, we're able to use TS&E projections to classify the control strategies of this transformer neural network. So this is also generalizable beyond just power descent that can be applied to any constrained optimization problem where a feasible solution exists. In future work, we're looking at extending this to more complicated scenarios, so 6 degree of freedom power descent guidance, and also looking at increasing our toolbox for prediction confidence, so including conformal prediction and potential Bayesian neural network or PAC Bayes bounds. And so if you would like to look at the full paper or the GitHub repository, everything is open source, so feel free to look. And thank you for NSTGRO and JPL for sponsoring this work.